Just how significant is the opposition to the upcoming increase to the price on carbon? As of this week, 7 premiers, including a Liberal one, are calling for a halt to the scheduled April 1st jump when the tax goes from $65 to $80 per ton of greenhouse gas emissions.
This isn't the right instrument at this time for the people of Newfoundland and Labrador.
I went as far as to suggest to the Prime Minister that he could achieve a win if he listened to the growing calls against the carbon tax and reversed his decision to increase the tax.
If they don't start putting money back into people's pockets instead of filling their pockets, they're going to get annihilated.
At a time when the cost of living is at the top of mind of every Islander and every Canadian, I think this is something that's just going to make that a little bit more difficult.
We don't need the backstop here in Manitoba.
So you will ask them not to? You're going to make a formal request?
Who's to say we haven't?
The federal Conservatives are also promising to bring motions to the House of Commons next week when it returns to halt the planned tax hike. Pierre Poilievre writing in a letter to Liberal and NDP MPs, in part, 70% of Canadians oppose this hike. 7 premiers have already echoed Conservative calls to spike the hike. The letter goes on to say next week Conservatives will force votes to stop the hike. For the sake of all Canadians, join us. The Prime Minister was asked to respond to the anti-tax hike movement. He did so in an 8-minute answer, arguing that while his policy may be unpopular, he believes the country needs it long term.
And yeah, it's not always popular. But I know that doing the right things today, that support people today, that deliver that better future, a generation from now, 2 generations from now, is going to make a huge difference in the path we take forward. And that's an easy thing for short-term politicians, short-term thinker politicians, to say, oh, we'll get rid of the price.
So does the Prime Minister risk burning too much political capital for the carbon tax? Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. Former BC Premier Christy Clark is here. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is journalist and author Paul Wells. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Paul, I'll start with you. I think the question I started off that introduction with kind of presupposes that the Prime Minister has a lot of political capital at this moment to burn. I don't think polls kind of indicate that's the case. How big of a mess do you think he's in with this upcoming hike?
Well, the other thing is he's got to be reluctant to burn political capital because the emissions on that are considerable. I mean, he can go right ahead. One assumes that he's not going to lose the NDP support over this. It's not going to be a confidence vote defeat of the government. And so he can go right ahead. And the timing's interesting. Brian Mulroney is going to be lying in state next week and lying in repose in Montreal. And there's been a lot of talk about how you can only be a significant prime minister if you make the unpopular calls. And I sense that Justin Trudeau has been listening to some of that discourse. But it's got to hurt when a Liberal premier in Newfoundland, who's already benefited from concessions from the federal government on this front, says that those concessions weren't enough. I don't know what goes on around, like in the 5 or 6 people around the Prime Minister, but once you get 20, 30 feet from the Prime Minister, just about everyone is calling on him, including a lot of Liberals, to dump this tax.
Yeah, I think Paul's point, Tom, about the fact that, I mean, what changed this week is that Andrew Furey wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, right? The last standing provincial Liberal premier said, please press pause against the backdrop of cost of living increases. It's one thing, to the federal government when Conservative premiers say it, because they can often characterize those premiers as being kind of light on climate change. Not to say that's necessarily true, but that's how they can characterize it. It's difficult to do that to one of your own.
Yeah, no question about that. Furey's opposition to this is something that's weighing heavily. But it's almost an interesting moment politically in Canada because Trudeau for a year has been getting pummeled by Poilievre, who's had basically a free game. He's just been able to target Trudeau, oh, your groceries are too expensive. That's just inflation. Oh, housing is unaffordable. That's your fault, too. And he's been going on and on. Here, Trudeau seems to be sincerely digging in. And by the way, it's not just the Liberals who have not gotten it done under our international obligations. We were the first country in the world to pull out of the Kyoto Accord. That was by the Conservatives. Before that, Croatia had done nothing to meet our international obligations. Trudeau's taken 8 years to get here. And I think that there are a lot of Canadians who actually do care a lot about Canada taking care of our obligations under international accords that we've signed to reduce our carbon footprint, our greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that that's something that Canadians will be supporting in much larger numbers when they start getting sizable rebate checks. This is the unspoken part of this deal. There are two main provinces that are excluded from the carbon tax. They're British Columbia, which was way ahead of the curve. And by the way, at the time, much to their shame, it was the NDP there that had the slogan, axe the tax, but because it was the Liberals who were bringing it in. And they did. And they brought in a carbon tax, and they're excluded from it. Quebec's excluded because it's in the Western Climate Initiative, Vashi. That's something that Ontario was part of. And when Doug Ford pulled out of the Western Climate Initiative, which is a cap and trade system between Quebec and Ontario and California, Ontario removes itself. All of a sudden, the carbon tax applies. So the 3 cents a litre that are coming in on April 1st, if Doug Ford had not pulled out of the WCI, it wouldn't be there. I think that everybody who cares about climate change, future generations, our responsibilities long-term. We're listening to Trudeau yesterday, and he spoke from the heart for one rare time. Yes, it was a long soliloquy. Yes, Poilievre is still going to smash into them with everything from groceries to housing and all of the other sins of the Liberals. But for once, we're seeing a fight taking place on solid political differences. Trudeau is starting to define himself and no longer accepting to be defined by the Conservatives. It's interesting to see.
I do understand the point that the Prime Minister made, Christy. This won't be popular, but I do believe it's the right thing in the long term. And I think it would carry a lot more weight if they hadn't done what they did in October, where the ideology could take a momentary pause to appease fortunes that were declining in Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, and I think we had this discussion, Vashi, when they first backed off on the tax in Atlantic Canada, and I think all of us said, okay, just wait till you see all the rest of the premiers in the country come howling for relief just the same way that they gave them in Atlantic Canada, and they didn't. And that's really complicated things. And I think Paul is probably quite right when he says the Prime Minister is looking at Brian Mulroney's example and with free trade, for example, and saying, I can sell this to Canadians and I'll go down in history as a great reformer. Well, the difference, and I'm going to Prime Minister Mulroney's funeral next week, and I can tell you, I've thought a lot about why the free trade sales job that he did worked. It's because he sold us something in 1988 called free trade. Lots of people opposed it. He brought it in, and it did exactly what he said it was going to do. It made our economy bigger. We became $1 trillion economy for the first time. Contrast that with Trudeau. Sold us the carbon tax 10 years ago, and it hasn't done any of the things that he said it was going to do. It's made life less affordable. Rebates it's collected $22 billion. Not all of it has gone back into the economy. Most importantly, we haven't met any of our climate goals. It didn't achieve what he sold us on, and I think the fact that he's failed at that is something that Canadians just will not overlook.
To be fair to the feds, I mean, the carbon tax is primarily most impactful, Paul, when it is at the higher, very much higher end of the scale. They decided to bring it in on a gradual basis. But to Christy's point, the problem with that is they haven't specifically said to what degree it will or it does reduce emissions. And they're just saying, look, this is the most effective tool, trust us, without kind of putting the numbers behind it or being very forthright that until it's $200 a ton, it's not going to have a massive impact on reducing emissions.
Yeah. And the Environment Commissioner said only a couple months ago that even with these measures in place, Canada's not going to hit its 2030 targets. There aren't a lot of jurisdictions in the world that are taking the gutsy choice that Justin Trudeau insists he's going to take. Japan has moved since the new year from emission reduction policy to a policy of green investment, which is basically spend a lot of money and everybody wins.
Like the U.S.
Exactly. And the United States has become, during the Biden presidency, the world's largest exporter of natural gas and oil. And he doesn't have a carbon tax. So good on Justin Trudeau for sticking to his guns. It must be increasingly lonely to do that.
Do you think it will ultimately cost him politically, or has it already?
It's already cost him politically. I mean, look, For all I know, I'm getting a bigger rebate than I'm spending on the carbon tax. I'm not a money details guy. I don't know. I noticed that this government has not done an awful lot to make that case to me and to my fellow citizens, whereas Pierre Poilievre is being very energetic in claiming the opposite.
I mean, they did rebrand it, but just kidding.